Well, hello there, my politically engaged spirits. Welcome to Sessions of Spirit number 27, Capitalism, Socialism, Communism, and the Truth. You might be coming in at this point in the game, and we are doing some pretty sophisticated philosophy here that might not make very much sense, but there are prior sessions that you can go to kind of catch up to where we are. But to help you out, if you're more interested in just the political stuff and you don't like the mysticism and all the other stuff that we sort of did, then I'll give you a quick recap so that you can at least grasp how we got here. And I'm going to try and go through the 26 prior sessions in 2 minutes. So let's get into it. In the first session of Spirit, we talked about Hegel being the greatest philosopher because he was like 115 of the greatest philosophers in human history in one person. Session 2 was about how nobody for the last 200 years understood how he did that. Number 3 is that once you do, you can change the world. Number 4 was about getting past the stereotypes of Hegel and grasping his first negation, which leads you to this sort of circle of reason, which is his true beginning, which leads you to number 6, that philosophy is like the sublation of religion and not just a negation due to this universal logic, which number 7, we're going to put into modern notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize in a practical way, which number 8 means you have to start with polemics as this like beginning of the universal logic. But number 9, that's only the first negation. There's a second negation that's called sublation. That's real refutation. Number 10 is that Hegel gave us a master class in this, which is this super sensuous logic called the science of logic. 11 is that the science of logic is incredibly profound. It's literally the speaking of the ineffable. Number 12 is that the purpose of life is to grasp this living logic. To 13, release everybody and liberate their spirits. To 14, feel like they're connected and belonging to a God. Which number 14 means, or number 15 means you can also talk about this as connecting to yourself in a profound way atheistically. Speculatively, you can be both. Number 16 is that all of our greatest minds of the past were just logic implicit, including our gurus. 17 is that we have to sublate old mysticism for new mysticism to grasp the power of now. Scientific mysticism. 18 is that the limit of our reason is the limit of our fun and flow. 19 is that a real philosopher deals in laughter. Number 20 is that the ideal philosopher does this over and over again to all the philosophies in history using the universal logic. To 21, overcome evil is one-sidedness. 22 is that our particular knowledge is lacking this kind of universality to it, which is why people are nervous. 23 is that we have to really grasp this logic concretely in a kind of plant-like living way to make sure we use these technologies wisely. 24 is that I'm giving practical examples of how to use the logic to start sublating people one by one. 25 is that to change the world, you have to sublate practical religions. And we gave an example of how to do that. And 26, we gave the opposite example with existentialists, how to sublate existentialist practice. That brings us to today. If your mic is on, if you could mute it, please, that'd be great for anybody who's watching on YouTube. So 27 has the title SOS, Capitalism, Socialism, Communism, and the Truth. Like I said, SOS has a double meaning, a kind of speculative meaning where it stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also stands for Save Our Souls, because Hegel said genuine philosophy, not abstract philosophy, is also practical, not just theoretical. You are supposed to use wisdom to make the world better in a practical way, to liberate spirit. So today's paragraph that summarizes the content goes like this. When everybody is self-developing, we have a societal spirit that is conducive to hyper-individualism. The new freedom and autonomy of a modern society free from the shackles of religious constraint can be harnessed by capitalism. Competition in free markets replace the feudalism and creed of the nobility. A new freedom for self-expression comes forward, but with it, growing pains and inequality and draconian production of pure capitalism. We owe much to capitalism for modernizing society, but like any dialectic, we find its opposite arise to balance it. when all individuals are developing together, the spirit of a society begins to change to protect the vulnerable, and such hyper-existentialism begins to regulate itself in a common reasoning where universals begin to become discovered in the flux of radical personal diversity. Laws to protect such diversity are implemented, which serve as the ultimate stability which unifies such diversity. This complete freedom and personal destiny is, ironically, changed into an ever-increasing collective destiny in an effort to continue protecting the growing diversity and new ways of expression of the individuals. Over time, what is the truth of this evolution for the universal and the individual? Is it capitalist? Is it socialist? Is it communist? The answer of speculative philosophy is it is all three at once. If you want to join me in the essence notes now, as usual, we have a lot there. So let's unpack its dialectics and pick up from where we left off in the last session. So in the last session, I provided a graphic that might not exist anywhere else. This is a fairly novel interpretation of Hegel. And we showed a graphic of how to compare essentialist, the kind of religious mode, with existentialist, their opposite, and showed that Hegel had a sublative way, a speculative way of holding those two contradictory positions in our minds at the same time in a resolved way that makes sense. And it's this circle of reason, this science of sciences, this circle of circles that he called his encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences. And, when we got to the end of existentialism, we said there's a great and profoundly rewarding truth to that kind of ideology. So when we did the session before that, number 25, and we got hyper religious, and we're talking about, God's everywhere, you are God, Christianity was the highest religion because it went one step further than just having gurus that are gods, but you can be God too. You are spirit, and that's God knowing itself. So we went freaky religious, which our religious philosophers will love because we went to their truth. We gave them what they wanted, and it's true. It can be logical, this concept of God within you, and this even the older notions of spirit. But we had to cancel something. And what we canceled was that the sensuousness that surrounds this super sensuous abundance, the speculative notion that we are 100% human and 100% God, what we're canceling is the sensuousness around that. And that sensuousness making this godness a beyond, where you need intermediaries that can abuse that privilege and that authority because you couldn't know it rationally. But of course, we know from previous sessions that the real truth of this incredible philosophical position is that, what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational. And we have to have the faith that the world really is rational, no matter how irrational it looks, while we're enmeshed in nature. And that's where existentialists kind of pick up. They said, well, let's just cancel it all, throw the baby out the bathwater, and start with radical personal freedom. And you can do that. So we can do that authentically. Now we can go to the opposite side authentically because Hegel shows the truth of that moment. And he says it's because this kind of essence, this perfect logic really does radically free itself from itself. And you do have radical personal freedom. And you can rebuild the entire science of logic, this incredible, profoundly eternal, pure thought thinking itself. You can rebuild that from the place of nature onwards. And it's still logical. It's just that you're making a presupposition that doesn't complete the circle of reason. So ironically, existentialists make the same philosophical mistake as the thing they're resisting, religion, which is that revelation is the truth. We end up in this crisis, though, where when we make our own meaning, you can turn into an Übermensch and the absolute Übermensch. But as a society, some individuals can grasp that in themselves and do a lot of personal cultivation. But as a society, we definitely don't feel like we're there. We're still in the nascent versions of consciousness, which is not yet Übermensch, a society of Übermensches, or an embodiment of that. So this is where we're going to get into the state and political economics. If you get, it sounds like you get this this hyper individualism when you're an existentialist. But Sartre ends his book Being and what was it? I'm getting them all confused now. Because we're sublated. What was it?
Being and time.
Was it Being in Time?
Being in nothingness. Being in nothingness.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, Being in Time is Heidegger. So Being in Time, no, Being in Nothingness is Sartre. And he ends kind of by saying that, all this development leads towards ethics. And he says, we're going to devote another book to that. And I think that's happening because the existentialist is good. The Übermensch is fundamentally good and follows reason. And reason naturally, like for Hegel, leads you to the good. It is the good. So when you're working in community, you should have some kind of universalizing of this, a deeper meaning that makes you feel like you belong, even if you're creating it for yourself in a self-created, self-determined community. So this is where Hegel and the existentialists kind of come back. Well, don't come back. He went there, but is completing the picture and saying that there is this concept of an ideal state. That sounds bizarre. It sounds like Hegel would not say something like that because there's this concept of pain in his philosophy, the negation, right? You can never get away from it. You're always going to separate what you love and hold dear, your religious, idols, your superstitions, your childish beliefs, whatever you want to call it. You want to hold on to that. Negation comes in and says, sorry, this is the truth. And you got to tarry with it, whether you like it or not. This is what growth is. You're going to overcome the absurdity inside yourself, whether you like it or not. So it sounds like there's no state that would do that. But Hegel is saying, well, actually, there is this organicness to reason, this living nature which frees us. That's the whole point of this. The point of life is this living logic that liberates the spirit, or maybe in an existentialist mode, liberates the mind. So this concept of a rational state is the ideal state. And if you don't believe me that this logic is living and it's plant-like, is how I used the example before. It's not like a literal plant, but it's got this concreteness to it where the pieces connect together, not in an arbitrary way or with gaps. We did sort of Frege, we did a Frege, and we showed that it's absolutely connected essentially with no assumptions. And it's kind of like a plant. A plant doesn't have gaps in its cells. The cells like grow into each other very smoothly. So here's another quote for you from the Lesser Logic, where he's saying, the defect of this empirical method is that a notion is not defined as it is in and for itself, but in terms of something assumed, which is then used as a criterion and standard of correctness. No such test need be applied. We have merely to let the thought forms follow the impulse of their own organic life. This is pure thought thinking itself. It's super bizarre, okay? It's super bizarre to think about it this way. But he starts presuppositionlessly, which means you don't need a thinker, an explicit thinker. The thoughts do this themselves through the dialectic. And the dialectic is very important, even with the state, because the state's doing the same thing. It's all growing, it's all alive, from the very smallest level, the most abstract thoughts, to the most concrete thoughts like the state. So he's just making a comparison here where when you're doing empirical method, you're doing something external. You're not doing it from the inner necessity of things. There's an externality to it that kills the life, actually, makes it kind of arbitrary. So he's saying, no, when you do reason properly, it's doing it itself. And it's carrying itself through to the state, and the state has to be based on this kind of logic that's concrete if it's going to be ideal. If it's not based on the concrete, it's based on something that is not concrete, which is abstract. But of course, here we say, if it's based on the abstract, it's kind of got this arbitrariness of sensuousness to it, because sensuousness and pure thought are opposites. Nature is the part of you that is the existential absurdity, which gives you the radical caprice and freedom to choose not to think rationally, while also being kind of like this canvas to allow rationality to come through you, which the existentialists say is just, your brain doing it, that pattern recognition. And then Hegel says there's also this other side, which is that it always existed in itself and thinks itself. So I think this idea of abstractness in the state, when the reasoning is not concrete, is where Marx gets this idea of commodity fetishism from, if you look in the comments here. And he's making this point about relationships, and that inherent to the commodities themselves seems to be this value. But I read a quote here, and if I'm wrong about this, you gotta give me a break, our Marxist scholars, because we're trying to sublate literally like 1,000 philosophers in the synchronicity document. So if I'm not doing justice, we'll just go to the synchronicity document where we're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize and do justice to this, to Marx. But how I interpret it, that makes sense with how Hegel kind of worked with sensuousness, is that it's just Marx doing the same thing in the state by showing that commodity fetishism has a stickiness to it. It has a fixity. And Hegel talks about the understanding having a fixity. That's why it's not reason. Reason has this fluidity where it moves, it sublates. As soon as it comes to a limit, it sublates the limit into a higher concrete unity that keeps the movement going. It doesn't stop, because as soon as something stops, it starts to die. So it has this kind of like plant, like the cells of thought move, and they don't fix you there. But commodities, of course, are these units of value that can be exchanged. And you can think about them in their abstract sense, which is that they hide something, and they make you fixate your purpose. You fixate on it, that the value is in the commodity itself. It's got a hold of you, and you kind of consume it in a bad infinite, and it leads to this sort of artificial replication of relationship that's not really satisfying. The real satisfaction is self-recognition with another human being who's equal to you. And you're not in these master-slave dialectics. You have this equality where you get a universal satisfaction that what you're looking at is reflecting back to your ideal self. And that's what freedom is, when the other becomes ideal to you, and it doesn't fixate against you in a resistance that is your enemy. And you got to fight with it, and it's painful, and it feels like a waste of time. So I think he's getting this commodity fetishism because he's kind of focusing on how the sensuousness in it, not the reason, that the real process of its development, which is all these extra things about human beings working together and the labor theory of value, and it's kind of hiding that in an immediacy, and then you consume the immediacy, and you can end up in these communities of exploitation because you're not thinking about the real value, which is giving rise to that. That's my interpretation. I think he's getting it from sensuousness, because sensuousness is this fixity, this finiteness. So Hegel comes along and he says, in his theory, his philosophy of right, he's saying that this whole process is just a breaking away of reason, pure thought, from the fixity of sensuousness. And he's showing it through abstract right, which is like legal status. And then he's kind of moving that towards a higher level of universalizing relationships. So not only does your logic in your mind become more universal because of the science of logic, but your relationships to other people also start to become more universal. And that's what we call law, right? Law is more objective, and it protects people. It's supposed to protect people. So not only do you start to become universal in your thinking, but the relationships with other agents starts to become more universal. And he's starting to build the state, what will become the state, from your individual practical thinking. And he's showing that you as an individual have to progress through plurality and get into these higher, more concrete types of community. So he says you have to have this moment of eudaimonia, which we covered before, to even think about other people and break out of this kind of commodity fetishism that's like what the animals are doing. They're just like consuming things all the time in a bad infinite. There is no higher level of reflection. And that's kind of where I give you the rest of these quotes here. If you look in the comments, Hegel is talking about the thing that separates us from the brutes is not religion. So this kind of quote that I give you about commodity fetishism from Marx, he says, the religion of sensuous appetites. So he's talking about, the sensuousness fixing you, and it's a religion. He's using religion in a bad way. Whereas at his time, people were using religion in a good way to say religion is what makes you more human, and you rise above the sinfulness and the carnality. But Hegel is kind of coming and saying sort of the same thing, but he's purifying what the essence really is of a human being that distinguishes them radically from an animal, even though we logically progress from an animal in terms of Darwinian evolution. But Hegel also resists that, and he says that's not the full speculative truth. The full speculative truth is that there is this kind of divinity, there is this like eternal logic kind of coming through nature, and that's what the science of logic is. But he says what separates you from the brutes is that they have instincts, which are these implicit, immediate impulses that they can't escape from. They can't change themselves. They just follow that instinct. And that instinct is still reason, but it's reason that's implicit in them. It's in their being, in their self-feeling. But humans come along and we have this radical divergence where we don't have we have those impulses that are the drives of animals become desires of humans. But there's something more that happens, and the changing point looks like it's religious. It kind of is, because this kind of division starts happening in religion. You start separating the essence of the human being from sensuousness in art and religion. But you don't get completely free of the sensuousness. You get this mix, this half and half in religion. We have half pure thought and you have half sensuousness. And the thing that makes you a human being is the pure thought. It is reason itself. The fact that human beings can reason, that's explicit pure thought. That's the only thing to Hegel that makes you different from an animal. It allows you to grasp the supersensuous realm and the universal as a universal. And so that's what allows you to create a universal that doesn't fall into the particularities of the drives as they're turning in you. It doesn't pull your attention completely into a particular. You can stay outside of it while running through them all. And then if you want, you can choose to put your attention into a particular, but that's a rational, practical spirit. That can be a rational passion, even though your other passions aren't necessarily rational. That's what the essential thing, the essential difference is. And it looks like religion is doing that, and it is, but it's only doing it partially, which is why Hegel gives them credit, why we try and give religion credit, that it was like a proto-science coming in with theology at the end, really trying to get the systematicity going. But the sensuousness kind of held them back from getting into the immanent logic that we could really know, and saying what is most absolutely present is the actual truth that we're taking for granted. It's our own thought categories, but you have to see them in this living way to grasp the truth, the way, and the life. If you want to use a Christian context. So here's a couple of quotes for you to look at that. And Marx is saying the same things, except he's saying, let's get rid of religion entirely. And I kind of say, Hegel says the state has to be rational in this pure thought way. And it's infinitely scientific, which means it's a sublation of this religious mode, not just a throwing out with the bathwater, not an abstract negation. Marx comes in and says, no, you got to throw the whole thing out. That doesn't mean that Hegel's saying that we're in a different realm. Like philosophy really is a qualitatively different realm. There's no sensuousness in the philosophical realm. It's pure thought thinking itself with us. So there is no more sensuousness. So we're not in the religious mode of consciousness anymore. But what we have preserved is what we as the religious want to preserve more above anything. The principle is the concreteness, is the godness. It's the whole thing. We want the whole thing. That's what we're preserving. But we're doing it in the kind of atheist existential mode. So I hope you can see the speculative. We're getting the best. What both modes want, they're getting. So the existentialists, the atheists are getting the super sensuous, the true logic, and the religious are getting the totality. That's what a real philosopher is looking for, because there's no gaps in reality. We are the gap, basically. We are the one that's doing the cunning of reason to sort of mystically allow ourselves as absolute spirit to know ourselves as the image of God, or a reflection of the totality. So we want to get out of this one-sidedness. Hegel is saying that we are somewhere kind of new, but he doesn't just negate religion. He gives them some respect, because we do owe a lot to that mode, as it was trying to break free of this brute nature of human beings. And all of those religions played a fundamental role. So even though Christianity was the final stage of religious consciousness, we can still rebuild all the other religions into their deeper truth of what the gurus were really saying. and we kind of get them out of the one-sidedness of their followers who try to write it down. I hope I'm doing justice there to the speculative moment. Marx comes in, he doesn't really do that. Marx comes in and he says, no, the state, the highest version of human rationality, is just the negation of religion. It's the opium of the masses. It is a delusional state. Get rid of it. It's an abstract negation. And I think this is where the spirit of communism had a really hard time growing, is because when you negate something, it persists. What you resist persists. So that's what he did to religion. And of course, as we covered in the previous sessions, about 85, maybe even more back then, 85+% of the human population was religious or spiritual in some way. So it really slowed things down, I think. Whereas if you just love them, people open up. That's how self-consciousness wants to overcome the brute nature, not fall into the abstract negation. But Marx was still right. This state, the rational state, really isn't sensuous. We are thinking with the pure universals, but it's a vindication of what religion was trying to do, not necessarily a complete dismissal. And it has a freedom to it because you're allowed to question in this stage, right? Science allows you to question your sensuousness and your universals to make sure they're systematic and consistent and correspond to real reality that you can really know. Okay, I hope I did some justice there. Marx claimed to put Hegel on his head, as we covered in the sessions on polemics. But as we know, the circle of reason it can circle back on itself. So Marx was probably being clever as a dialectician, and he's probably starting with the atheist moment by ignoring the science of logic as essence, starting with the existentialist moment and dialectical materialism, and then moving around, rebuilding the logic from an atheist perspective, and then saying, oh, this is what we really are. This is objective, right? And this is kind of what modern science is doing. But eventually you have to kind of admit the circle of reason, or else you're making a non-scientific claim. It's not justified, which we're going to cover 2 sessions from now. So in modern, so these guys are old, right? So where are we at in modern times? Well, Zizek sort of has the same interpretation that I do, or I have the same as him. He's saying that you got to blend Marx and Hegel. Hegel inspired Marx. And in his book, Less Than Nothing, I give you a quote here where he ends the book trying to end on a sort of hopeful note in terms of practical spirit. He writes this big tome. It's really theoretical, mixing Lacan and all these more modern philosophers with these great minds of Hegel and Marx. And he says that, you know, the first thing to remember is the radical asymmetry of the class struggle, which is the Marxist stuff. The aim of the proletariat is not simply to negate, in whatever way, its enemy, the capitalist, but to negate or abolish itself as a class. This is why we are dealing here with a third way, which is neither proletarian nor capitalist, which is not excluded, but also with the suspension of the principle of contradiction. It is the proletariat itself which strives to abolish itself, its condition. Sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook. This is why people in the lay working class, the blue collar, where I come from, they don't want to read this stuff. But I hope I'm really giving you some context, especially if this is starting to go worldwide and we're starting to get the grassroots going. You can know this stuff. These are just hyper intellectual people trying to be nuanced. But what Zizek is saying here is he's just repeating what Hegel is saying. And Marx is also saying this in the end, but he didn't finish his polemic on capitalism, which means he couldn't sublate. So what he's saying here is that, yes, don't just do the first negation, Zizek is saying. You're going to get yourself into the spirit of negation, which twisted the historical communist movement into its opposite and became this atrocious example of what not to do in political economics. But Marx himself warned historical agents to be careful when they apply his model. He was smart, right? He didn't finish because of contingencies of life, family, and this kind of stuff, he said. But he was a great mind. So our Marxists in the room, we are identifying the truth here. Marx was onto something dialectical. But when he was trying to start the movement, you have to do the first negation. He knew that. You have to do the polemic and agitate the hegemonic structure. But of course, it's going to negate you back and condition you. So the proletariat have to negate the capitalists, right? There's a real limit there that you have to overcome. And it's very painful if it's not scientific, right? It's just brute kind of violence. My interest against yours. There's no self-recognition happening. But this is supposed to lead to the second negation. If you don't get out of that negative moment of reason, as we know, there's two results to dialectic. Hegel says the first is contradiction. They just contradict and cancel each other, both sides, and you end up in a nullity, nothingness. But then if you don't do that, you do the sublation. You get to the positive moment, and this is exactly what Zizek is saying here. He's just talking about sublation. And you might be getting tired of it, but you might also be starting to recognize the universality. Remember, I said before, the difficulty of grasping this essential logical move of the universal knowledge, this guru type knowledge, is this sublation concept, which is missing everywhere. Sublation is so simple. It's literally the negation of negation and this three-part move: cancellation, preservation, and raising to a higher unity. But it's everywhere. It's the universality that's hard to grasp. And you can, if you did not see sublation in Zizek's paragraph here, you will understand the power of it. I was able to decipher this paragraph because he's using just different words for the same thing. And we can recognize the logic in anything. And here's a good example of it, I hope, that the condition he's talking about is that the opposition, the first negation, is where the capitalists condition the proletariat, but the proletariat conditions the capitalists. So if they resist each other, they condition each other forever. And they just do that in a bad infinite. So the only way to get out of that is what the gurus say, the mystics can say. You have to do a transcendental lateral move that breaks you off that entire spectrum, and you do something radically and completely new. What is Zizek saying here? We have a third way. That is new. We're doing something new. I hope that makes sense in terms of Hegel's logic, because that's what Marx said we need to do, is use the master's logic, which is Hegel's logic. That's what inspired him. He just thought Hegel was too religious, but he wasn't, of course. He was just more sublative than Marx. At least on the outside, he wrote letters to Engels saying that he knew what he was doing, which I think is true. I explain that more. So, okay, we're in a kind of modern interpretation, and it's based on sublation. I think Zizek is right. We have to do a sublative thing here. So then, okay, what is the order? If this is all dialectical and we have to have this progression, what is the order then of this, like negation, sublation at the state level? Well, is it socialism, communism, capitalism? We know there's got to be three. You know, it's in history. It seems like they belong together. Or do we have capitalism, communism, socialism? Or do we have communism, capitalism, socialism? So is communism in opposition to capitalism and then it sublates into socialism, like Zizek is saying? Or what are we sublating into here? What's the condition and what is the freedom? Marx gives us some hints here. So Marx tried to do this dialectical analysis in a scientific way. And he says, you got to start with capitalism because capitalism is the sublation of feudalism. So as much as we want to stereotype Marx as saying that there's nothing good about capitalism, he actually said, yeah, there is. It is literally the sublation, the more rational state than feudalism. There's something more rational about capitalism than feudalism. And, you know, that might not be a huge compliment, but it is something positive, affirmative. And it's that the worker relations are becoming more rational in that we have employers and employees, which is still a master-slave dialectic, but at least there's a chance to have some kind of objective law that's protecting people's rights in some way as individuals. Whereas in the feudal state, you just had like the lords and stuff like that. And they just told you what to do. And if they wanted to kill you, they could kill you. And the law was a little bit arbitrary. It was based on their will, not completely, obviously, but that moment of caprice is the lack of the universal logic. It's the sensuousness in the nobility that can do whatever it wants. It has this existential moment in it, this radical, absurd freedom. So that's the kind of scary thing at the universal level, because this is what can be ruling you. And it's incredibly oppressive when somebody's irrationality is imposing on your rationality. So Marx is saying, yes, we at least have the first moment of the dialectical triad here of the universal logic. You start with capitalism. Okay, we got 1 out of 3. What comes next? Well, it has to be a rational progression. You can't bring in anything from outside. He agrees with Hegel that you have to develop the concept from within itself. It has these things called contradictions that we know the notion moves by. Marx gives it this sort of special language of an internal contradiction, but it's the same thing that Marx is saying is the second moment of logic, right? Remember, there's 3 moments of logic. The abstract understanding, where you hold a concept in artificial, like by itself, but we always know there's an opposite to it. So it does it by itself, it has an opposite. And then it kind of wars with that in the moment of process, the negative moment of reason. And then once the negative moment of reason completes itself, it sublates itself into the positive moment of reason. So these internal contradictions are supposed to carry capitalism to its opposite automatically. And it's happening in history because history follows the science of logic. So there is a guy that's done this analysis already, and I think he's the closest one to the true particularity. We're not talking just in theoretics, we're doing something practical. We're dealing with the actual state of capitalism today. So this guy is still alive, David Harvey, and he did this dialectical analysis. And I think he grasps a fundamental aspect of it in terms of the universal form of logic itself. So any real theoretical understanding of the truth has to follow this notional pattern, which is that we have the universal, the particular, and the individual connected in a judgment that sublates itself in a syllogism. So these are really old rational structures of logic that are kind of boring, and Hegel brings them to life. But we kind of see him doing this here, whether intentionally or not. He puts it into three parts, and a syllogism has three parts. This doesn't sound profound, but once you grasp that all the diversity in your life at every level, from childhood to your family life to, you know, interpersonal romantic love to everything, is really, it all has three parts. All of it does. And if you don't have those parts in the right order, you're going to have a rough life. This is the secret of Aristotle, is that literally you have, if you grasp something in its universality, its particularity, and its individuality, and you put it in a syllogism after you judge it, that's the only way you know you have the truth. It's corresponding with your reality, so the correspondence model of truth, but it's also the coherence model of truth, that the logic in itself, the notion in itself is consistent. This is the cheat sheet. This is the cheat sheet of logic. And it looks like he's using it here. He's saying, okay, even if he's not, we're going to try and do it, right? The first part of syllogism, the thesis, is these foundational contradictions. That's the abstract understanding, the first moment. You're just saying what the principles are, and they're not really moving. You're just saying what they are. And then you move on to the moment of process, moving contradictions. The negation, the dialectic thing is the foundation rebuilding itself in the other to find its internal contradiction. And he's giving a whole bunch of, he gives 17 here amongst these three categories of how capitalism is going to contradict itself and turn it to its other. And the third part is that these contradictions really do create a new state. They feel dangerous because something new is going to happen. I haven't read his book entirely, but if Hegel is right, this logic will follow the dialectic, and the speculative truth will be the truth. So he gives you 17 things here, which I think is a pretty good particular analysis. But in the end, we know it's supposed to just turn capitalism into its opposite. What is the opposite then? I believe it is socialism, and I think Marx says that too. But Marx's writings evolved over decades, so it's kind of confusing because there are paragraphs of him saying that the opposite of capitalism is communism. But that might just be the absolute. That is the affirmative progression. So we have a being that then negates itself into a finite mode, and Hegel says that this is the mode that doesn't have like a true affirmative being. It has a beingness in the movement, but the real affirmative being is capitalism. And then once you go through the movement of socialism, which is the opposite of capitalism, it sublates into another concrete being, which is another affirmative in itself, which is communism. So you could, if you're just looking at the affirmative progression, you can just go from like a feudalism, capitalism, communism, and you can skip all the negative moments of process, right? And Hegel says that's what the absolute is. The absolute is the unchanging thing. If you look at it that way, you have the plurality of the absolute that is not changing. It's absolutely the substance of itself. So socialism is not the permanent thing. It is just the opposite of where these internal contradictions lead capitalism. And out of these 17, I think Marx hits on something critical here. And it's that, yes, he might say communism is the opposite of capitalism in maybe this absolute sense, but the real abstract opposite is socialism. And the essential distinction between capitalism and socialism is probably what David Harvey is talking about in point 14 here, is that there's a freedom that occurs that's not present in either mode that its sublation does have. The sublation is communism, or it's supposed to be for Marx, at least in later Marx. If not, I think that Hegel at least says this, because in Hegel's philosophy, right, he's preserving the individual moment. He's saying you can have corporations and stuff like that. It's just the structure, the system has to be dialectically balanced. It has to be in this notional form. And that's why he kind of advocates monarchy, because there's like an individual moment, and then there's a particular moment, and there's a universal moment. And the figurehead is like the individual moment, which we're going to talk about in, I think, session 33. But it's really the system that makes sure that reason is the sort of essence governing things, that makes our existential freedom into something that's more universally coherent, more pleasant to be around in community. The Uber community, the Ubermensch community. Okay, so what is the thing though that's creating the conditionality that's limiting freedom between socialism and capitalism? It is that what is changing, if you look here at the analysis, in capitalism, the capitalists own the means of production and the workers are exploited. Okay, that's draconian capitalism. Okay. But then it has its internal contradictions, and people rise up, the workers rise up, and they're getting tired of this, and they say, okay, you guys can still own the means of production, but we're going to create unions. But the thing here that you need to grasp is that the unions don't change the freedom of the actual ownership structure. They don't own the means of production. They're still working under the capitalists. So what happens is that's what gets sublated. What we change in communism is that you get rid of the condition, that first negation by negation. This is the classless state. This is the freedom from the proletariat and the capitalist mode themselves. This is what Zizek is talking about. And what you're doing is you're saying that the ownership dialectic is now changing. You are now saying that you don't just have unions, which preserves the abstract negation. You are now saying the workers are the owners, and the owners, what used to be the capitalists, are also the workers. You're everything. And this is the ideal, I think. This is how you get to this classless kind of state in a non-naive way, logically. Because now you are listened to as the worker, but you're also the owner. So it kind of guarantees a higher level of universality, that your opinion, your individuality will be heard because you're an owner. You're legally forcing the organization to listen to you and not subjugate you, and listen to your reason and incorporate it. This is the fundamental sublation, I think. If you don't do that last dialect, even if you do all like 16 of those 17, if you don't do that one, you're just repeating some other version of the condition. So I think Marx is right, even though he didn't finish his polemic, that even if Hegel finished this kind of corporate moment, his whole thing is that we're supposed to be achieving higher and higher levels of self-recognition with each other. So in a way, you're achieving higher and higher levels of ownership between all things in society. And you see yourself in the other, and the state reflects that. And I think this is how you talk about it in political economics. So to move on, we're embracing this kind of insight, where we're developing a sort of app called the Worldwide Essential Workers app, based on this idea that everybody is essential. That means the 1%, which are trapped in this sort of draconian capitalism, they're also essential. We're not gonna, Marx says you have to rise up, and you have to, the proletariat has to rise up and seize the means of production. There's a specter haunting Europe, he said, or haunting the world. And he said that specter is communism, and it's gonna we're gonna seize the means of production from you jerks that are the proletariat, the bourgeoisie. And it's a negation. It's a very spirit of negation, right? They're freaking out the aristocrats, basically, the upper class. And of course, what do the upper class do? The elites, they negate back, because there's no self-recognition there. You don't want to identify with somebody that wants to kill you and cut your head off like in the French Revolution. So of course they're going to resist. So we don't want to do that. And if Marx would have finished his polemic, he would have did the polemic of his own polemic, which would have been the more blessed sublation, where no, everybody is treated as essential. Because once the proletariat rise up and they seize the means of production, it's just a cooperative structure where everybody actually belongs as workers and owners. So you're not losing that sort of, the elites aren't losing complete control. They're being incorporated in their beauty, their ideal truth, because they're trapped in the system too. So the Worldwide Essential Workers app is meaning essential in this kind of Hegelian sense, where everything has its right place in the right order on this like circle of reason, which includes the state, the rational state anyway. So WEWA stands for Worldwide Essential Workers App. There's 5 concepts here that I think will prevent us from making the mistakes of historical communism or historical capitalism or historical socialism. In a sublation, you need all 3 moments, right? This is the mistake of the polemical moment, is you're saying you don't need them all. Well, in a sublation, they're all ideal. That's why it doesn't matter, as this practical spirit grows with these sessions of spirit, it doesn't matter what orientation you start in. You're a socialist, we're going to sublate you. You belong, you're essential. You're a capitalist, you're right, you have a truth, you belong, you're essential. You're a communist, okay, you were trying to do the sublation thing, but you didn't finish the polemic, so you're in the negative spirit, which is why you're kind of sabotaging yourselves with this anger and causing what you're disliking to persist. You also belong, you are also essential. And we're just putting people in the right order. And so these 5 words are to help do that. And it's saying, okay, this app has to be a global, worker-owned, cooperative social enterprise app. It has to be global because right now we don't have a counterbalance to global capitalism. We have individual pockets of capitalism in the state, on the state level, in the individual nation level. And where capitalism has developed, people got exploited, as we know in history. And then the opposite rose up. The internal contradictions happened on that kind of particular level. And then we have like national socialism, which are state welfare programs and stuff like that to protect the poor and vulnerable. And then you kind of have that sublating or trying to sublate into communism. So in a lot of individual countries, we don't really have pure capitalism anymore. We have socialism. But globally, we do just have a capitalist structure because we don't have a global opposition yet. There is no formal government to do socialism to regulate the draconian race to the bottom of capitalism. So that's a necessary moment of the dialectical evolution that we're going to go through. The pandemic is causing the global population to rise up because we're all sensing something is horribly wrong. We're being subjugated. And the data economically is showing that's exactly what's happening. 1/3 of all wealth is supposed to go to the 1% in this broken, irrational system by the next 10 years or something. It's radical. Like this is the highest level of global wealth concentration in human history, apparently, or at least within recent history. So we want to go global because we want to balance that, but we don't want to have that painful abstract negation. We want to do that because we're not naive. That will happen, but we want to sublate it immediately if we can. And that's the only thing that will do that is the universal logic, because the way we think determines our being in the world. And Hegel's giving us that science of logic as the masterclass in sublation so that we can kind of speed it up, but don't speed it up the way Stalin did. If you speed up the abstract negation, you just cause a lot of pain that undermines the spirit, and then you get trapped in double binds. So it's got to be global and it's got to be rational. And we don't want to have this one state communism, because then if you try and compete with capitalists and you're sharing with your people, they're just going to race to the bottom, pay people less, and just like undercut you in a prisoner's dilemma. The person who does the wrong thing wins. And this is a huge philosophical problem, ages old. So it's got to be global for that kind of reason. If you don't make it global, you're going to repeat history. The second concept was worker owned. So this has to do with this kind of ephemeral, subjective mind spirit thing, this intangible thing that's like fluffy duffy, and it doesn't really seem that important, but it really is the essential point. The whole point of life is just the liberation of spirit, the liberation of your mind, and your materiality reflects that. So ownership is the abstract right that Hegel's talking about that leads to a rational state, because the ownership, the legal status of ownership, guarantees you have to be listened to, and that your voting has to be listened to. That's just your rationalities in particular going to the universal. And it creates, if you really believe in the state, you really believe your ownership is working, you will self-recognize with your state because you feel heard, you feel belong, and it's reflecting your opinion. And if you have universals in you, you have a real truth, the state has to listen to you because it's philosophical. The rational state is not just artistic, it's not just religious, it is the philosophical state, which is the sublation of those two. So that self-recognition is actually the whole point. And we dismiss it because people don't understand the purpose of life because they don't understand the living logic. So that worker-owned thing is absolutely essential, or else you're just going to get some version of a union again, where the union starts working for the bourgeoisie or whatever. So even though you have a cooperative structure, there's an internal social relation where the superstructure is actually just repeating what it was doing in capitalism, but now it's doing it in a covert kind of way. So then it starts undermining itself, which is what happened to Stalin. Okay, so I hope that's making sense. I might go a little over time, guys. I hope you don't mind if this is making sense to you. This is really important stuff, because once you start getting practical, things get kind of serious, and the sublations have to be quite well done. So those two moments are very critical. The third moment is that it has to be a kind of cooperative structure. So the ownership has to be real. The sharing of the goods, the compensation model, has to be fair across everybody in the model. And so everybody, there's a scientific study that says, what would you pay people that is the most rational? Well, what is the most rational is to give them $90,000 a year, everybody. And that's because that's what it takes in terms of purchasing parity to meet the 11 life areas of needs in a comprehensive way, not just for emotional security, but to create that moment of eudaimonia that raises us from subjective spirit that Hegel's talking about to objective spirit, which is where the state starts to develop. You have to go through that moment of eudaimonia to start thinking rationally about other people, because you're satisfied. You have a more universal satisfaction, but the state is the higher universal satisfaction. So they did a study on our particularity, because we're being particular now. We're talking about particular religions. We're talking about particular existentialists. We're talking about real things in our current epoch, because we're going to sublate them, or try to. I guess in our current time, it's $90,000 in North America and Canada, but this is purchasing parity. So it'll be the equivalent of 90,000 in India and other countries that have different currencies. But the other thing that needs to happen here with this compensation model is it has to tie itself to production and inflation and CPI, which changes the purchasing parity over time. The problem with money is that it's a representation of value, and it has like desire built into it. So you can get speculation that turns into Wall Street, whereas like the real economy, the real goods and services are separated from their prices. It doesn't reflect reality. So what we need to do is we need to bring the price mechanism back into alignment with real value. And you do that by tying the incomes of the workers to the production of the system. And this, you do this by making them owners. It's guaranteed. It like kind of welds them together, so that you don't have to do these strikes. Strikes are just like productivity going up, and then the workers being exploited, and they have to risk their lives and their livelihoods, which is very scary and painful. And I've done that myself. And then if you don't get killed, then you get a little bit of an increment, and you got to do it again like 50 years later. It's really brutal. And it creates this business cycle that constantly repeats itself over and over and over again. And that's why I kind of put this picture here of these contractive waves, because contractive waves are the business cycle based on ideas. And Hegel is saying that really what's happening in history that's really valuable and infinitely valuable is that the idea of spirit is coming to higher levels of realization. And what we consider a new exemplar of technology, a new cultural technology, something that really provides better goods and services that increases the quality of life, is just us actualizing spirit to a higher level, because spirit is good. But of course, we as existentialist, completely free beings, we can of course misuse those ideas and do negative things, do abstract negations with our enemies that persist magically, right? So really, GDP, gross domestic product, all the value that separates poor countries from rich countries, rich people from poor people, is really just this idealistic process. It is really just uncovering ideas and then turning them into material goods and services. That's commercialization in terms of modern political economic language. So we want to tie the incomes to that process directly, that spiritual, universally logical process. And I give you a couple of sources to look into this stuff. But one of them is Marx, because Marx figured this out for himself too, and Hegel also figured this out for himself too. But there's even conservative political economists that are grasping this. And there's a famous guy named Thomas Sowell, who, when I was reading him back when I was in political economics, he said something that made him famous, which is that he pinpointed what it was that differentiated rich countries from poor. And he says, not just education, there's a bunch of things that play into it. Education, energy, all that kind of stuff. But he says the essential thing, that if you don't do this, you will be poor. You can have high levels of education, but if you don't do this one thing, that education is not going to translate into discovery of new ideas, which realizes spirit or realizes a higher quality of life. And that is research and development. R&D, research and development, is literally the dialectical process of pulling the universals out of the cunning of reason into the known so we can use them with our practical spirit. That's using Hegel's law terminology, but we're doing the same thing with modern logic in modern science. So you even have conservatives pinpointing this, and I think it's correct. The value process, surplus value that Marx was talking about, is based on the ideas. So the intellectual property system that we have globally really is the determiner of value, besides just pure, absolute, chaotic violence and brutal oppression. But it's a very broken system right now, and I know that because I tried to file a patent for like 8 years on this kind of system. So it's not really working for the common man. It's another might is right kind of thing. It's not completely rational, but it's not completely useless. We are making progress. So we're lucky to have the IP system that we do, because at least you have at least a chance, theoretically. We just want to make it practical. Okay, so the cooperative structure is really important to make sure that purchasing parity doesn't erode and people don't go through these business cycles that are very painful, where a new idea comes in, the rich kind of buy it up, they drop the rest of the economy on the poor, and then as they're riding up the idea and the poor are struggling, then they uncover the next new idea that is the exemplar for 50 years and defines the long business cycle. And then they say, okay, they see what's coming, and then they sell off all the old stuff to the poor who are desperately trying to get out. And then it crashes and the poor are crushed again, and they're riding back up, right? We want everybody to participate in this idealization process in a much better way. Okay, so the only way to do that is universal logic. Social enterprise word or term is this more modern concept that's sublating the nonprofit and for-profit mechanism. So we want to be this legal structure that forces the organization to give back in an optimal way when we're making profit. When we are uncovering new ideas, there will be surplus value. What do you do with that? Well, usually the executive kind of hoards and says, we're the most rational, so you guys are kind of our peons. No, we're going to do something different. We're going to allow a radical new education system where these new ideas immediately get put back into the totality of the science, because Hegel gave one big science, the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. And that will create a radical efficiency in learning and efficacy, where you don't have to use rote memorization. You can actually use a profound sense of heuristic to grasp the inner unity of things that anybody can grasp. And so this will make it realistic that the discovery process can be shared in a much more efficacious way. And instead of maximizing profit, the social enterprise structure maximizes spirit, because it's all about education. So as soon as the production happens, it gets shared in this way that's like not respected, but Hegel says is the point. So then the last part is, well, how do you do this realistically with millions and billions of people? Well, that's what the app is for. So the app is an immediate feedback mechanism. It's in our hands and our phones. As the wealth grow, or as we raise the poor up in a sublation, they will also have phones. But we will be making these flow state games, which is what political economics really is. You're defining goals, you're giving immediate feedback, you have a challenge level of the jobs that have to be done, and the skill level of the workers, and they have to be matched. And then you have to have clear rules, which is the legal system, to make sure people aren't doing tax loopholes and all the stuff that's happening at the global level. So we're just going to create this global philosophical game in a rational social enterprise. But the social enterprise will probably pave the way for this socialist movement that will then immediately spontaneously create the new global state. But we're not talking about a new world order here. We're talking about a new world spirit. When you talk about an order, we're just talking about that sort of brutal, it doesn't have that nice plant-like loving nature to it. It creates this opposite where it's dead in some way. It's fragmented. So the new world order means you have to coerce and subject people to it, whereas self-recognition allows the education process to bring people together of their own free will and determinism, their own existentialism, their own radical freedom, because they are determining the meaning for themselves too, at the same time that it's actual objective logic. Okay, so the app makes that realistic, and Uber and these other unicorns worldwide are doing this right now. I work for them, I've seen it happen. It is the future of work. It just needs to be in a different spirit, or else we are going to get a new world order. It's happening right now. I was incredibly exploited and paid less than the minimum wage laws in Canada because they got around the loopholes of our labor protections of the last 100, 200 years by saying you're self-employed because you have the app in your phone and you own all that. It's incredibly clever, but it's in the wrong spirit. So we need to do the opposite of that, and it is possible, and it can happen quickly if we have this higher spirit. That's why I put this last sentence here, where even me, anybody who's running this organization, we grow together. As the app makes more money, as these courses go around for free and we educate people, we give them that soft, squishy part for free, the philosophical part. The purpose of life is the living logic. All our material systems, like the state, are just a reflection of that. We will do a sort of Gandhi movement, where Gandhi was in his famous white robes, because I read anyway, it was because he wanted to his base, the poor and the vulnerable, to identify with him. And he said the poorest were wearing those types of robes and rags and stuff like that. His were, of course, clean, but he was creating this self-recognition right away. And this new income will be the same. We're not all going to get paid 90,000. We're not going to get paid $1 million. It rises together in this cooperative structure where, as we make more value and we uncover more concepts and IP and stuff like that, we just give out bigger and bigger dividends, bigger and bigger and bigger. So that self-recognition is absolutely essential. And that's what we're not letting go of here. That's the science of logic thing that I'm holding on to with all 38 sessions, as you can tell by now. That circle of reason really is the meat and potatoes, or as a vegan, as me as a vegan, the veganese and potatoes, I don't know. So now we're gonna get a little bit squishy here, but our mystics, maybe the stereotype of the physiognomy of women, they're supposed to be representative of this higher logic, but they do it implicitly. They are the divine idea. That's why they get it. That's why it's intuitive to them. That's why they're more intuitive stereotypically. But you can break out of your stereotypes by grasping genuine reason, not abstract reason, which is this masculine, only men can think, blah, 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 sexism type stuff, which Hegel says that happened in history. So he says that's true too. So our incels and our MGTOW guys, there is that moment, but don't fall into the abstract negation. It conditions you and keeps you from what you really want. You have to sublate it in genuine reason, which is this living logic. And you can make it explicit. So women intuition can become explicit as masculine rationality. You can do both. You can be a man that has feelings and you're allowed to express them, and you can be logical, but you can also be feminine and be emotional and also be logical, and do it vice versa. Like you can go back and forth. I hope I did that right. So here's him getting into love and state, Hegel. All are infinitely valuable. This was supposed to be the Christian moment. That was the fulfillment of the Buddhist moment. That was the fulfillment of all the great gurus of the past, just making it explicit, not just theoretically, but practically too. That's why Jesus died, apparently, is because he went against the state, and the state was still in a more irrational state, no pun intended, and they negated him because they saw him as an abstract negation instead of a sublation, which is what he was really trying to do. I hope I explained that in the universal logic, but here's a quote directly from Hegel talking about this stuff logically. And he's saying that what is love? He's saying there's you and an other. And saying here the limit or restriction that previously was immanent in desire and self-seeking is canceled. So when you have an other, you have that commodity fetishism going on. And so you consume it and then it just replaces itself. Consume it. You never get this lasting satisfaction. So he's saying there's a limit there. That object limits your satisfaction. You don't have control of the object. The object actually has some control over you. And modern marketing in a capitalist system, they're using that to hijack your impulses and your subconscious to control your logic, which is hyper-consumerism. They're taking advantage of that radical freedom, that existentialism in you to self-determine. They're determining you for you with these micro nudges, micro marketing. So Hegel's saying there's a cancellation here happening fundamentally between you and the object. He's saying self-consciousness reaches beyond itself and continues in an other self-consciousness, so that there is no longer two self-seeking individuals opposing each other. Rather, there is a single self-consciousness, and it stops this self-seeking. So you see yourself in the other. So when you consume it, you see yourself still. There's a higher persisting satisfaction where you're getting beyond the commodity fetishism and you're seeing the real relations behind the objects, the real production, the supply chain, the people in Bangladesh that were exploited. So maybe the commodity will now be upgraded to a fair trade certified standard, which protects the people all the way through the supply chain, because the process of the state is to protect the individuals so that they can be liberated in this higher concrete universal. And right now, our international trade rules are not doing this kind of cancellation. They're not seeing the workers in the process properly. They're exploiting them because we're racing to the bottom in this hyper competition. So you can see here, I highlighted singularity, particular universality. This is a sign that Hegel is using the universal logic here. He's explaining something that's lovey-dovey and usually intuitive and indeterminate, and he's making it determinate in a scientific way. In fact, the only universally scientific way which is the elements of the notion, which are the individual, the singular, the particular, and the universal. So you can read that quote more in depth to grasp the logic, but here's the essential sentence that relates this to the state. Thus, the struggle for recognition has disappeared. In the family, the child that is weak and without desert is nevertheless recognized. In society, all citizens are recognized and count as free. The freedom of every individual exists only insofar as he is recognized as free by the others, and the others have in him the consciousness of their own legitimacy, that they count for him. In a rightful situation, that means a rational situation, every person counts because he allows everyone else to count as free. I am free insofar as the others are free, and I let them count as free just as they let me count as free. And he's saying that in love and friendship, this counting is more at the emotional level, but in civil society, I count as an abstract person without regard to my subjective particularities. That means it doesn't matter if you're nobility, if you're a rich person, whatever. He says, just because you are this logic, just because you are the notion, just because you operate in syllogisms, just because you are spirit, you get all these things, all this love, all this recognition. Even if you're weak and vulnerable and you're a bad citizen or you're a criminal or whatever, you might not be the ideal rational citizen. It's to sublate that, because that's just an abstract negation that you absorb somewhere in the process of self-actualization. I'm really hoping I'm doing a good job connecting the dots here for you. The state is supposed to be like this. Remember, the stereotype about Hegel is that he's a totalitarian fascist, where he says the state, you have a duty to the state. And we showed that no, you get eudaimonia, and it sublates with Kant's idea of the state, and you're doing both. You're supposed to be happy and doing your duty as a sense of destiny, where your existential moment and your determined moment, the logic, the objective kind of logic of your own thinking, if you're determining your own meaning, they're happening together in synchronicity in this kind of harmony that's destiny with you as an individual and you as a citizen of the state. This is also happening in families and civil life. It's happening at every level. So here's us talking about the logic of this lovey-dovey stuff that is actually the essential purpose of it all. You can talk about all this crazy political economic language, which is hard to decipher, and commodities and prices, and like this kind of like, there's no love in this language. It's like rigorous, almost, this is scientific economics. But really the whole point is this living logic, to be free. And we're putting it in its logical form. So we get the logicians taking it seriously, and we get our mystics and our emotional and our mothers and our intuitives taking it seriously. If we get our mothers doing this and breaking out of the stereotypes, which they are doing, the glass ceiling is being shattered, but that's abstract negation. So we might get a reversal where the men start to get conditioned in this oppression. And a lot of loving mothers who are grasping this deeper logic, they're trying to protect their sons and keep their hearts alive so that they don't become these like rigid dead men, and they can actually have loving relationships that are reflected in. So if you don't do this, you sort of end up doing what Stalin did with the kulaks. So I'm going to give a quick example of how this goes wrong. Stalin deserves love too. Hard, I said this earlier, and we lost a couple of people. Some people just cannot overcome the horrible things he did. And it's true, he did horrible things, but everybody, if Hegel is right, the rational is actual and the actual is rational, there's a kernel of rationality in everybody. So Stalin somewhere believed that he was doing something good, or he had a complete psychotic break, but he did a lot of reasonable things that makes it look like he wasn't. That's the easy way out. So if he was a rational guy, what happened? If he believed in this communist ideal and he understood this lovey-dovey stuff, well, he didn't do lovey-dovey things. He killed millions of people and it was put on his shoulders. So why are there people devoted to him? There's like still tons of Russians, tons of people from the USSR from the past that still worship Stalin as a great leader. How is that possible? How do we sublate that? I think it happens by looking at the actual past and doing a scientific ethnographic study of really getting beyond our sensuous like desires to want to like hate and say what really happened. And there was a moment in history where I think it started to twist on Stalin. I think it started before this, but this is where it really became objective. So Trotsky and all this, like his rising to power, he was an artist, like he was a romantic, like there's really a profound soft side to Stalin, just like with Hitler. But they did these incredible, weird, like terrible things. But I think this compromising logic started to twist Stalin into his opposite, the non-ideal of himself, where it came with the kulaks. The kulaks were these kind of a little bit more upper class farmers, and they own the land. So what they said goes, basically, even against the state. So they owned it, the state didn't own it. And with communism, Stalin said the state has to own everything, or else you have the caprice, the irrationality of the farmers dictating how the state should dole up its food. And it says, no, there has to be something more universal. And you can't just be at the whim of all these farmers. So Stalin said, I believe in the communist vision. I am a true revolutionary. I care about the poor. They don't understand that their unfreedom is due to these kulaks because they're in false consciousness, Marx calls it. They don't understand that they're under this exploitative structure. Or maybe they do, but they can't get out. So he says, I am the true believer. I will do what no one else will do, and I will push history forward. No matter what, he said, you have to do the abstract negation. So if we got to do it, we're going to do it completely, and we're just going to get past it. That's probably what he was thinking on the good side of him if you didn't have a psychotic break. So the kulak said, okay, you want to take, you the state want to take away our land and create this higher, fluff, everybody owns it kind of thing. But you're centralizing power. Yeah, right. This is you hypocrites. So the kulaks, of course, didn't self-recognize with the state. They didn't trust it because they didn't see the logic in it. So they said, okay, well, no, we're still in abstract negation. They didn't talk that way, but this is the logic. And they said, try us. If you take the land from us, we're going to starve everybody because we control the food supply. And Stalin said, you're talking to a real deal here. I'm a real world spirit. I'm the guy that's going to change things. I carry the truth. And he did it. He said, he did it. He said, yeah, test me. And they played a game of chicken, and the people paid the price. And millions of people starved to death in this famine, I think in 1933 and around that area. So now you can kind of see why people, if that's the truth, now you can see an idealized Stalin. You can see, well, this is what he was trying to do. He just made too big of a compromise. And what ended up happening, that soft, squishy stuff, the self-recognition in his own team twisted. So he had like 900 of his inner circle turn against him and start negating him. And what he did, he said, he knew that was coming. So he said, I'm just going to negate you back because you're not real. You don't understand why I did what I did. It was necessary. So he killed them too. And then it really undermined the spirit of the movement, and it was stuck in the negative moment of reason, and it never got out. And so there's still a burning kernel of truth there. People want that ideal of what he was striving for. So that's why it's still alive. There's universals there. And that might be what the Ukraine war and the Russian war is about right now, even though Putin's not admitting it, right? He's saying the opposite. I'm not trying to rebuild the USSR. I'm not trying to do the universal. Well, the whole point is the universal. And he thinks that he's right. He's doing the right thing, and that he was provoked by NATO. NATO is the capitalist structure taking over everything rampantly because we don't have a global system that's working right. The United Nations feels powerless. And Hegel predicted that. He said you can't have a League of Nations that can stop this kind of thing because the particularities prevent an identity from forming that creates this actual practical living logic to becoming actualized in the world. That's the global living state. That's supposed to be the new world spirit, not the new world order. So I think that's what's going on there. And we don't want to make that compromise. The only way to not make those compromises in a negative polemical moment is by having incredibly high levels of self-recognition in the logical rigor at the core of your movement. It has to be realized by everybody in the core. And that's why the wisdom quiz, you can't get into a position of power in this new spirit unless you prove you know how to sublate. That's the only thing that you need to master, so that anything that comes against you, like a kulak, you can have a higher level of diplomacy, a higher level of rational conversation where they can idealize with you. And that creates a really high level of self-recognition really fast before the moment of history catches up to you and then traps you in these contingent irrationalities, which is what happened to Stalin and the kulaks, unfortunately, and the millions of people who died. It happened to Hitler too. It basically happens to every single person in history, whether you're good or bad in terms of the history books. The history is framed by the winners, right? So we are going to go through the same thing, and you can't abstractly negate. There won't be any of these compromises. Everybody's infinitely valuable. So if you don't do that, you get put in these things called double binds, which I'm going to talk about more, I think, in the Adorno session and the horror of dialectic. But this is why these 6 words here and this lovey-dovey paragraph comes first. As I'm explaining, if you don't do this, you don't grasp that universal living logic, you end up in this situation. Even if you're a great and dedicated and loving person in yourself, history will turn you into your opposite. So we're not being naive here. This logic is incredibly powerful, and Marx was grasping it. He just didn't finish it. So it allowed this kind of stuff to happen. It wasn't sublative enough. So, okay, does this really solve the existential crisis of our existentialists? Do we really have a higher meaning in this? Yes, we do, because we're preserving the lovey-dovey stuff, but we're doing it logically, which means non-naively. And you can negate it and talk about it and critique it. It's explicit. So you're not like a parent-child relationship where you're just a child, you have to do everything the parent does because they tell you to do it. Logic is explicit. It allows children to question the authority figure and the authority figure.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. I get most of what you're saying, but I mean, Hitler was a mass murderer. His only intention was to murder Jews.
So there are exceptions, right? But they're rational exceptions. So some people are born with brains that literally can't think rationally, or what we would call rationally. So those people are literally out of control and they're disadvantaged. They don't have this privilege of spirit connection like we do, or self-consciousness. Some people are literally born without mirror neurons. They literally can't create some moment of recognition. Some people are born with a lesion in their brain, which disrupts their ability to have harmonious relationships, or it numbs them with a tumor. When we study some of these criminals, we see that they were either extremely traumatized and it numbed them on a very fundamental level as a child, or they had some kind of biological thing going on. So with Stalin, the easy thing is to say he was one of those people. But I agree with Zizek and some other scholars, which is that's the easy way out. Because if you say that everybody's just, insane, then when the next person comes up, you don't know how to ration with them. It remains indeterminate, and indeterminacy prevents you from recognizing them before they come and do their irrationality again, their caprice. So we're not being naive here, that we are accounting for that moment. That irrationality is accounted for. So we will be able to recognize that because we're trying to create self-recognition with everybody. We're listening to their logic on a profound level. And maybe these serial killers and these people that have that kind of life experience will be honest with us and say, hey, look, I have these drives that I can't control. And because they feel safe in the state, they will come into the system and we will treat them in a much more humane way, or as humane as we possibly can. And Hegel gives a really fantastic example of this in an essay he wrote called Who Thinks Abstractly? And he gives an example of the wrong, superficial way of treating the criminal, where you let them go kind of free and you put flowers all over them and it's very sensuous, but it misses the logic, which is no, you have to admit the criminal is a criminal. He did something wrong. So he gives an example of this guy who gets his head cut off as a criminal, and this woman comes and she takes the head, she puts it to the sun, and she says, see, even this criminal is worthy of the light of the sun shining on his dead face. Still worthy. But that doesn't mean the head's not cut off. He did something wrong, but it doesn't mean that he's intrinsically worthless. It's just that he had an unsublated negation. His spirit didn't rise. So that's what we have to kind of do. Real sublation is not naive. And I think that's what your comment was about. I hope people could hear what that guy said. There's somebody who spoke up just now. He said, what about criminals and murderers that want to go out and murder? That impulse is coming from the drives. It's not truly rational. I hope I did a good job showing that. But here, Hegel says something kind of profound. He's saying that this existential crisis becomes incredibly meaningful, even if you are creating it, because you are creating a state that is kind of heavenly. It is ideal. And it's based on this higher level of rationality where everybody's recognized. So he says, when you accomplish this, there's a really cryptic paragraph in his philosophy of right that many people don't know how to interpret, but I'm going to try and apply what we know so far to it. So he says, this state forms, and he says, these two realms stand distinguished from one another, though at the same time they are rooted in a single unity and idea. Here their distinction is intensified to absolute opposition, and a stern struggle ensues, in the course of which the realm of mind lowers the place of its heaven to an earthly here and now, to a common worldliness of fact and idea. The mundane realm, on the other hand, builds up its abstract independence into thought and the principle of rational being and knowing, i.e., into the rationality of reason, or rationality of right and law. So he's doing a switch here. So the first two realms that he's talking about are the supersensuous realm and the sensuous realm. The realm of sensuousness is where the state is, but the minds of the people that govern the spirit of the state are in the supersensuous realm because they're returning to the science of logic as thinking rational spirits. Whether you think of that as the essence or as the existentialist, it's coming through you. So the two realms, he's being cryptic here. He's not telling which ones they are, right? But he's really just saying it's the supersensuous realm of logic, of pure thought, and our actual mundane realm. And he's saying that the first realm is, even though they're distinct, they're also forming one whole, right? So they're connected, even though they look distinct. He's saying that the first realm, there's a struggle that happens between these two worlds, and it causes the first one, the realm of mind, it comes downwards. It lowers its place of heaven, what religion calls heaven, this perfect reason, right? And it comes to an earthly here now. Remember, time and space are sensuous. So now he's making the transition to the sensuous realm where our state is. Our individual state, but also like the government state. That's a nice little speculative moment there. But he's saying that without this living logic, the world is mundane, it's boring. You get stuck in ordinary, ossified, rigid thinking. That's what boredom is. But he's saying the other side doesn't just stay still either. The supersensuous realm is coming down to the sensuous. The sensuous realm, the boring version of the realm, is actually also developing itself, the existential moment, right? It is rising up. The pure thoughts are coming through us, through our sensuousness, and we're sublating it. We're getting to higher levels of universality in the sensuousness, and we're actually having pure thought coming from two directions to meet itself. And the abstract independence, where they're separated from each other in this artificial way, actually comes into this more organic unity where they actually are forming one idea. There's just two different sides of it, now uniting explicitly through reason. And it's losing, when this is happening, this opposition loses its marrow, it disappears, and you get this harmonious kind of the coming together of the barbarous and the caprice and all that stuff that comes with sensuousness, as we know. It's coming and it's being purified with this truth, which is connecting to this kind of perfect reason and being embodied as the image of actual reason. And he's using religious kind of language there because we're supposed to be in the image of God, right? But the rational state kind of is this blessedness. So basically what he's saying here is that the rational state is the amazing Ubermensch state, but from the religious perspective, it's kingdom come in terms of the religious perspective. In terms of Buddhism, it's nirvana. You break out of the wheel of samsara. Our needs are met. You get to 90,000. That's what he's saying here. And it's really hard to interpret this if you don't keep sensuousness and super sensuousness, pure thought, and the finite world. If you don't keep them separate, you don't know how to keep them separate, then you won't know how to bring them together. So I hope I really did an incredible job interpreting that paragraph that has long stymified philosophers for the last 200 years, whether Marxian or Hegelian or dialectical of some other kind. I hope that the previous 26 sessions helped you understand this. And if you're just coming into the session, hopefully you can go back and grasp it. But the saving grace here, guys and girls and people beyond, is there are two fundamental sublations at this point in the Sessions of Spirit that if we don't do them, we are going to get twisted into our opposites in the practical spirit. I'm going to go over the first one. This is our big sublations. The first one is that we've already covered logically how philosophy is not the abstract negation of religion. It is the sublation. If you abstractly negate religion like Marx did, it's going to persist and is going to cause 85% of the human species to turn against this state we're trying to build that's ideal. So you have to sublate with them. That's the first thing we got to do. I think we're doing a pretty good job at this point in the session. We still have, I think, some Buddhists, some Christians. We have the religious should hopefully still be following along. We didn't totally abandon them. They're seeing enough of their truth to keep going. Jesus was 100% man, 100% God. He was your savior. He did die for real freedom. I think that's the essential principle. As long as we preserve that, they'll stay along. We'll stay along because we're also religious. We're also the spirit. In whatever religious symbol, a pharaoh, whatever symbology, until the synchronicity document is filled out, I'm just making do with my own limitations. So please forgive me. I'm trying to sublate, and I invite in your feedback to help me sublate better. But we're canceling the sensuousness. So the sensuous Jesus is what's causing a lot of the problems. But you're not losing the way, the truth, and the life when you do that. So that's hopefully making sense. But the other thing is, we just did the second big one. The second big one is if we treat communism, or whatever we want to call the next rational state. Communism was just Marx. It was supposed to be a scientific state, right? And he was the father of modern sociology because he was building the logic behind our social relations, and that's what creates commodities. And whatever we call it, it can't be an abstract negation of capitalism. There is something in capitalism that is right, and we are preserving it. And fundamentalist, abstract Marxists do not want this. They're so angry. They're giving into that negative, like anger is that resistance, right? They're so angry, they can't sublate. And it's actually undermining the movement. Like Zizek says, we need to do something new. So this is the new thing. The lovey-dovey logic thing is the whole thing. The science of logic is the linchpin. We're just applying it. So if it starts to sound repetitive, it's just the same thing in different forms, and it creates an incredible ease. Once you get it, it creates an incredible ease in you. It creates a sort of like a relief. It takes something off your shoulders. Your thinking gets clearer. So we are not going to abstractly negate capitalism. There is something that we are negating. That's not, there's a limit to capitalism. We're seeing with the wealth concentration, this incredible existential crisis we're feeling. But we are going to sublate that limit. Okay, so this is very uncontroversial. So I'm going to give you guys some more material to protect yourselves from the scholars that are going to come and negate the crap out of you, because they're going to, once the truth of this comes out, they're going to wish they did it first, because we're in a hyper-draconian competitive academic system where we're all competing to the teeth to survive and gain meaning for ourselves. So I created a presentation called The Slaughter Bench of History to Blessedness. And I explain a better, more pictorial way of how the logic progressed in history. And it actually overcomes the slaughter bench, or the first negation, by becoming more scientific. Science actually is the process of becoming more self-recognizing in whatever is other to us. And it becomes more peaceful because we accept the process itself. The process itself is also important in self-recognition. The enemy is just ourselves, and we clarify that limit much more quickly, which means the war element stops. Okay, so I give you a spreadsheet of direct quotes too of how I built this interpretation. It's not cherry picking. I went through all his works and I found the same thread. He's doing both of them speculative, the first negation and the second. So I give you some ground on how to justify the second negation as blessedness. But in terms of existential language, it really is just the Übermensch creating meaning and flow state. I put the video there for you too if you want to watch it. I did a presentation on it. So if you feel empowered by this and you feel protected, then and you don't want to make these mistakes that are probably going to happen in history if we don't do something. There will be some kind of global something happen, whether we're oppressed or we rise up or whatever. If we want to hire a more meaningful, blessed sort of version of this that doesn't repeat history or the business cycle, where everybody's essential, including the elites, right? They're supposed to be our guardians, actually. This will idealize them into guardians because they are gifted and they're worried about being oppressed by the people who don't want them to rise up. They have envy, right? The first negation. They're just escaping the same logic. Both sides are. So everybody will be essential in this worldwide essential workers app, this new Hegelians want to change the world in CRISPR. So if you want to get practical and you see the wisdom in this, there's the Hegelians want to change the world Facebook group. You can leave some questions there and we can start educating people. That self-recognition is important. Talking it out is important. It's essential. So we have to have forums to start doing that. There's also the wisdom quiz to check your one-sidedness, to make sure that you're not creating an enemy you can't sublate. Because the more power you have, the more people you're going to have, the more dialectics you're going to have to sublate, because diversity comes to you as a leader. Then the synchronicity document will be us showing a cheat sheet of how we've sublated all the other religions and idealized them and showed them as either foundational and building them up to their true guru mystical understanding, or their fulfillment. And they're all necessary if they have real philosophy in them, real universals. And then we can use that to sort of go into our technologies like CRISPR and make sure we're applying this universal logic where everybody's infinitely valuable. We're canceling limits wisely, but we're sublating them and preserving their truth. You can go to CRISPR and do that because that one is really rising up fast and will create an incredible power differential that will stratify our spirit if we don't do something quick. And then there's also the universal survey of wisdom. If you want to help spread that, we're going to find out where we need to sublate, like where's all the negations happening, and then go and reach people where they are. We're not forcing people necessarily to us. We're going to allow both doors to be open. If people can self-recognize and they want to learn, then they can come, but we can go and meet them and love them where they are in a wise kind of love, right? A wise kind of recognition, a wise kind of logic. So now that we've sort of addressed this hollowness inside of ourselves as an existential being that's radically free, we also addressed it in terms of the state as a community of people with this meaning-making process happening in a limited way. We're moving past this fetishism, this fixity, and we're grasping the true purpose of life, this living logic in everybody and everything. And this leads us to Buddhism. This leads us to a kind of mode of living where we can get another 500 million people idealized in the world, it's about 500 million Buddhists, as sort of this combination of the essence and the existentialists. So I hope you find that exciting. And if we have some Buddhists tailing along, please join me for the next session. And I hope you continue sublating as the ideal philosopher and spirit that you are.